May 21st, 1945, 4:20 in the afternoon. In the makeshift American field hospital erected among the ruins of what had once been a Japanese administrative building in southern Okinawa, Army Medic Corporal David Chen looks up from bandaging a wounded Marine's shoulder to see a young Korean woman standing uncertainly in the medical tent's entrance, her presence suggesting that she might be the interpreter he has been desperately needing to communicate with civilian casualties who speak no English. Chen has been treating wounded soldiers and displaced civilians for 6 days since American forces overran this section of the island, but language barriers have made medical care nearly impossible when patients cannot describe their symptoms, injuries, or medical histories. The appearance of someone who might speak both Korean and English represents a solution to communication problems that have been frustrating his efforts to provide effective medical treatment. The woman appears to be in her early 20s, dressed in clothes that suggest some level of education or official capacity. A simple but clean dress, shoes rather than sandals, hair arranged in a style that indicates attention to appearance despite the chaos of battle and displacement. Her hesitation at the tent entrance suggests uncertainty about protocol rather than fear of American soldiers, which Chen interprets as evidence that she might have experience working with military personnel in some official capacity. Chen approaches her with the kind of professional courtesy that medical personnel extend to interpreters and administrative staff who help facilitate medical care. He speaks slowly in English, hoping that she might understand enough to confirm her role as translator and begin helping him communicate with the growing number of civilian casualties who need medical attention but cannot explain their conditions. "Are you here to help with translation?" Chen asks, gesturing toward Korean civilians waiting for medical treatment. "We have patients who need care, but we can't communicate with them." 8. The woman, whose name is Kim Sunja, though Chen doesn't know this yet, stares at him with an expression that combines comprehension with something much more complex than simple willingness to help. She understands his English well enough to know what he's asking, but she cannot find words to explain why she cannot serve as the translator he needs. Why her presence in this American medical facility represents escape from circumstances that have no equivalent in his experience. Kim nods slightly, not because she agrees to serve as interpreter, but because she recognizes that this American soldier is offering her some form of official role that might provide protection from the Japanese military personnel who might still be in the area, who might reclaim her for the purposes that had brought her to Okinawa against her will 6 months earlier. Chen interprets her nod as professional agreement and begins explaining the medical situations where he needs translation assistance. He points toward elderly Korean civilians with injuries that need assessment, toward children who might have information about missing family members, toward adults who could help identify other civilians requiring medical attention. But as Chen describes the translation work he needs, Kim Sunja realizes that she cannot fulfill the role he's assigning to her without revealing circumstances that she has no words to explain in any language. She cannot simply serve as medical interpreter because her presence on Okinawa represents participation in a system of sexual slavery that the American military has not yet discovered, documented, or understood. In war, survivors wear many faces. People displaced by combat develop strategies for presenting themselves in ways that provide maximum safety, minimum scrutiny, and access to resources that might ensure continued survival. The ability to appear useful, official, or harmless can mean the difference between protection and vulnerability in situations where military authorities determine civilian fate. But sometimes, misreading survival reveals unspeakable truths. Sometimes, the assumption that makes a displaced person appear to be something familiar and unthreatening prevents recognition of experiences that challenge understanding about the nature of wartime atrocities. Sometimes, the mistaken identity that provides temporary safety also obscures systematic crimes that require acknowledgement and justice. The Comfort Women system had been operating on Okinawa for over a year when Kim Soon-ja encountered Corporal Chen in the American Field Hospital. The Japanese military had established facilities throughout the Pacific Theater where Korean, Chinese, Filipino, and other women were forced to provide sexual services to Japanese soldiers under conditions that constituted systematic rape and sexual slavery. Kim had been recruited from her village in Korea through deception that promised factory work in Japan, but delivered her instead to sexual slavery in military facilities that moved with Japanese forces from one Pacific island to another. The system was designed to prevent exactly the kind of escape or revelation that her encounter with American forces now made possible. The Japanese Comfort Women system relied on isolation, language barriers, and the assumption that military authorities would not investigate civilian women whose presence in military areas appeared to serve administrative or support functions. Women like Kim learned to become invisible except when required to serve their designated function, developing survival strategies that avoided attention from anyone who might question their circumstances. Chen's assumption that Kim might serve as medical interpreter reflected his lack of knowledge about Comfort Women facilities and his expectation that Korean civilians in Japanese-controlled areas would be present for legitimate reasons that aligned with American humanitarian objectives. The possibility that a young woman might represent evidence of systematic sexual slavery had not occurred to him because such systems were not part of American military experience or training. Kim's inability to explain her circumstances reflected not just language barriers, but also the absence of vocabulary in any language for describing experiences that existed outside the boundaries of what most people could imagine or understand. The Comfort Women system had been designed to operate beyond the awareness of international observers who might document or prosecute war crimes. Do you think Chen's assumption that Kim was a translator reflected his desire to find practical solutions to communication problems? Or do you think it revealed broader cultural assumptions about the roles that women might play in military contexts? Do you think Kim's inability to explain her circumstances reflected language barriers? Or do you think it revealed something deeper about the unspeakable nature of systematic sexual slavery? The misunderstanding about Kim's role began to unravel when Chen asked her to help communicate with other Korean women who had been brought to the American medical facility for treatment of injuries that Chen initially attributed to battle damage or displacement trauma, but which gradually revealed patterns consistent with systematic abuse rather than combat casualties. Kim's interactions with these other Korean women revealed knowledge that went beyond casual civilian contact to suggest shared experience of circumstances that none of them could adequately explain to American personnel who lacked cultural and linguistic frameworks for understanding what they were witnessing. The women's behavior toward each other indicated trauma bonds that extended beyond ordinary civilian displacement. More significantly for Chen's growing awareness, Kim's attempts to translate revealed that the Korean women's medical needs included treatment for conditions that were not consistent with combat injuries or displacement hardships, but which suggested systematic physical and sexual abuse over extended periods. The medical evidence contradicted Chen's assumptions about civilian casualties and suggested more complex circumstances. Chen's medical training had taught him to recognize signs of sexual assault and systematic abuse, but his military experience had not prepared him to encounter evidence of institutionalized sexual slavery operating as part of enemy military logistics. The realization that Kim and the other Korean women might represent victims of organized war crimes rather than random civilian casualties challenged his understanding of Japanese military operations. The conversation between Chen and Kim, limited by language barriers but gradually revealing horrific realities, evolved into Chen's recognition that he was encountering evidence of atrocities that required documentation and justice rather than simply medical treatment. Kim's role shifted from assumed interpreter to war crimes witness, whose testimony would be crucial for understanding Japanese military practices. Kim's gradual revelation of her circumstances, communicated through broken English, drawings, and desperate gestures that transcended language barriers, introduced Chen to the systematic nature of comfort women facilities and the industrial scale of sexual slavery that the Japanese military had implemented throughout the Pacific Theater. The other Korean women in the medical facility began sharing their own experiences as they recognized that American personnel might provide protection rather than simply returning them to Japanese custody or abandoning them to uncertain fate. Their collective testimony revealed the scope and organization of the Comfort Women system in ways that individual accounts could not convey. Chen found himself documenting not just medical conditions, but war crimes evidence that would eventually contribute to post-war tribunals and historical recognition of systematic sexual slavery as a component of Japanese military operations. His role expanded from medical treatment to historical witness in ways that his training had not anticipated. The medical facility where Chen had encountered Kim became a collection point for testimony about Comfort Women facilities throughout Okinawa and other Japanese-controlled territories. The assumption that Korean women were present in military areas for legitimate purposes gave way to recognition of systematic abuse that required justice rather than simply humanitarian assistance. Chen's reports to his commanding officers about the Comfort Women system became part of American military documentation of Japanese war crimes, contributing to evidence that would support post-war prosecutions and historical recognition of sexual slavery as a systematic component of Japanese military operations rather than isolated incidents of individual misconduct. Kim and the other Korean women who had been liberated from Comfort Women facilities faced the challenge of rebuilding lives that had been shattered by experiences that most people could not understand or acknowledge. Their survival required not just medical treatment, but also social recognition of their experiences as war crimes rather than personal shame. The broader implications of Chen's discovery extended beyond individual cases to systematic documentation of Comfort Women facilities and recognition of sexual slavery as a war crime that required institutional rather than individual response. The medical evidence that Chen had documented contributed to historical understanding of Japanese military practices. After the war, Kim returned to Korea carrying physical and psychological scars that would affect her for the remainder of her life, but also carrying the knowledge that her experiences had been documented by American personnel who recognized them as war crimes rather than personal failures. Her testimony became part of the historical record that would eventually support legal recognition of Comfort Women as victims of systematic abuse. Chen returned to civilian life as a doctor in California, where he specialized in trauma treatment and advocacy for survivors of systematic abuse. His encounter with Kim and other Comfort Women had taught him about the medical and psychological consequences of organized sexual violence and the importance of believing survivors whose experiences challenged conventional understanding. The field hospital where Chen had first encountered Kim was eventually converted to serve Korean and other Asian civilians who were returning to their home countries after liberation from Japanese control. The facility became a processing center for documenting war crimes and providing medical care to survivors of various forms of systematic abuse. The story of Chen's misidentification of Kim as a translator became part of post-war education about the Comfort Women system and the importance of recognizing systematic sexual slavery as a war crime rather than a cultural practice or individual tragedy. The assumption that had initially provided Kim with safety had also nearly prevented recognition of the atrocities she had survived. Historical documentation of the Comfort Women system eventually included testimony from American personnel like Chen, who had encountered evidence of sexual slavery during the liberation of Japanese-controlled territories. Their reports provided crucial corroboration for survivor testimony that might otherwise have been dismissed or minimized. Kim's story became part of broader movements for recognition and justice for comfort women survivors, illustrating the importance of listening to voices that challenge comfortable assumptions about wartime experiences and civilian roles in military contexts. Her encounter with Chen represented a moment when survival strategies intersected with opportunities for historical documentation. In the end, the medical encounter that had begun with mistaken identity became part of historical recognition that systematic sexual slavery had been a component of Japanese military operations rather than isolated incidents of individual misconduct. The translator, who was actually a survivor, had helped translate unspeakable experiences into historical evidence that demanded acknowledgement and justice. If stories like this make you think about the survivors whose experiences challenge our assumptions, about the voices that must be heard, even when language barriers complicate communication, about the systematic atrocities that require recognition rather than comfortable ignorance, then perhaps you understand why some mistaken identities reveal deeper truths about war crimes, why some medical encounters become historical documentation, and why the most important translation sometimes involves helping survivors find words for experiences that exist beyond ordinary vocabulary.